In this video, you'll be learning about this topic.
So Lawrence, I want to start by talking about Warren Buffett, the man, right? We know a lot about his philosophies, which we're going to get into, but you know him personally, have met him many times, even hosted this symposium with him back in the 1996 that kind of led to this compilation or compendium of his essays. And I want to address all of that, but start by kind of what makes Buffett who he is. So for example, some of our listeners may have figured out by now that you can study Warren Buffett to death, but actually replicating his performance is highly unlikely. And I just want to know what you attribute that to most.
You're right. It's not replicable, or at least not likely to be replicated. It's a combination of compelling traits, and most people will be happy to have one or two of them. But it starts with rationality. He tries always to keep his emotions in check and focus on the facts, on the substance, on the probabilities. Second is analytical acuity. He tries to think deeply and hard about any particular problem, whether it's a business, an industry, or a person. And he's humble. He's got tremendous humility, particularly given his strengths in rationality and analytical acuity. He knows his strengths. He knows where he can do well, and he knows his limits. The circle of competence is his famous phrase that defines the difference between what he knows and is good at and what he doesn't know and tries to avoid. And I think if you're trying to get the secret sauce or maybe surprising things, I think the singular trait or skill that explains most of Warren's success over that long period and in particular settings is his ability to size people up. He knows it's an uncanny ability. I mean, the others we can teach ourselves a little bit. We can create our own discipline. We can develop analytical acuity, and we can certainly define our circle of competence. But this uncanny ability to size other people up, he knows who's trustworthy and who isn't. He can tell in a minute whether this CEO will be a faithful steward of Berkshire Capital. He can tell pretty easily whether this family will be a reliable partner in a long-term business, whether this CEO of this publicly traded company is worthy. How can he do that, or what can we get out of that? I'd say the skill's uncanny and it's hard to teach, but here's the tip I have, or the lesson I've taken from it. It's another thing he does. At the slightest whiff of lack of trustworthiness, he goes away. So he's ultimately a very skeptical person of human nature, of the incentives that drive us to be selfish or to be emotional, irrational. It's a high hurdle to gain Warren's trust. He runs a trust-based organization. He delegates, gives his managers enormous leeway, as we'll get into. But he does all that only with a handful of people. And that, I think, helps him with this sort of ability to discern trustworthiness. His hurdle is very high. He has the neat tests, maybe useful to ordinary people thinking about how to do this themselves. He calls them the son-in-law test or the daughter-in-law test. He only wants to go into business with people he'd be happy to have his child marry. Or the other version of the test is the executor test, that people he'd be happy to have administer his will and carry out his wishes after he's not around. Those are pretty high hurdles that a lot of people go into business with people they wouldn't want to watch a football game with or trust with their estate. But he's been pretty rigid about that. And so when you look around at his inner circle, let's say, the CEOs of the companies, members of his board, top shareholders of the company, the CEOs of investees, all very high grade people, very not just professionally competent, but ethical. And so there have been a couple mistakes. Everyone makes mistakes, including Warren. But so I think you're right. It's hard to replicate the skill set. I think any of us would be happy to have one or two of those four virtues or skills, combine them. But I think we can all learn something from each of those.
That's really interesting. I've never actually thought about it that way. After meeting Buffett and hearing him speak, even for a short while, you see the high intelligence level, the high IQ, and he's rattling off numbers from memory from dating back decades. He's always citing dates with events. He just really has a mind for numbers, and it's very apparent he has a very high IQ. But what you brought up now, almost as a superpower, is that he actually sounds like a high emotional intelligence, or EQ. And you don't often find both. I've never actually really considered that with Buffett, having both in that department, but that sounds a little bit like how you're describing him.
I think you're absolutely right. I should concur particularly with the high IQ and his mastery of data and history and facts and numbers. I'll just add a point where the IQ and the EQ go together in a business setting. I get this question from young CEOs a lot. about, well, how much diving into the details do I do versus how much delegation? And what's Buffett's approach? And my impression from Warren is he dives into the details. He knows exactly I'll make it up, how many candy bars See's is selling, what the steel content of precision cast parts assembly is. He knows all that stuff. He enjoyed it and remembers it. But he doesn't second guess people on it. He doesn't say, I think you ought to make more candy bars or reduce the steel, raise insurance rates. Or he stays out of direction, but he knows what's going on. And so it's kind of a nose in, body out kind of idea. And why is that useful? It's useful precisely if your plan is to trust people a lot. You won't know whether they're vindicating that trust unless you know the facts. So you know the facts and then leave them alone. And then you'll know when the occasional miscreant appears. They don't tell the things they tell you aren't the things you know be true. And you'll be able then to weed out the mistakes. So that combination of IQ and EQ, I think you're exactly right, Trey. It's rare. It's extremely valuable. And I think being aware of it can help us, ordinary people, do better in settings where the combination is particularly useful.
I'm glad you touched on that because I don't think Buffett gets enough credit for being an operator. The wide public thinks of Buffett as a stock picker, and he's surely doing a great job of that. But what he really excels in is running a conglomerate with wholly owned subsidiaries. And what you just touched upon, I think that's really the holy grail of running a business, right? Figuring out how to set up a decentralized system where you don't have to be included in every single decision. Otherwise, you just can't scale. But also knowing what's going on in the business so you can incentivize and motivate everyone the right way. And, like you said there, Lawrence, Buffett does that better than anyone.
You're absolutely right. And I think his investment success is long running and well known. Again, 60 years ago, it was really spectacular for the first 20 of those and then excellent for the next 20. It's been a little more ordinary in the last 10 or 15, mainly because of the massive size of the organization. But also during that recent period, they've diversified into ownership of businesses and the balance sheet flip that you described. But he's been astute in the ability to manage or oversee such a large, diverse group of businesses. And I think that his ability to do that is now worth study. What did he do? How did he do it? How does he continue to do it? Because I think it's useful for other managers. I think people are increasingly studying Berkshire and its decentralized, autonomous, acquisitive, trust-based culture, and will come to rank it as important in management as value investing has been in securities analysis and investment. And in this sense, everybody listening probably has heard of Ben Graham, Warren made famous as a theorist or philosopher of valuation, value analysis, security analysis, stock picking, and so on. As they study Warren's approach to management and organizational structure, the famous person who will emerge there is Tom Murphy. Now, Tom, as people know, many people may know, he's on the board of directors of Berkshire now and has been for about 20 years. Warren's been a close friend of his for 50. Tom built up the Capital Cities communications company, had some relatively small radio and television broadcasting company in the Northeast that Tom built and grew through organic growth and acquisitive growth over a long period of time, eventually acquiring or merging with ABC and then eventually selling that whole thing to Disney. And along the way, tutoring Bob Iger, who's had a great run as CEO at Disney. He was a Tom Murphy protege. But Tom did all that using the principles that Warren has adopted. Very acquisitive, trust-based, frugal, focused on high quality businesses and high wattage managers, and then left them alone, leaving it in an autonomous structure, gave managers enormous leeway to run their businesses in a very highly decentralized way. And so a couple of years ago, I published a book about Berkshire's culture, and I asked Warren who should write the preface. Said Tom Murphy. He said, because Tom Murphy taught me everything that you say I do in this book. And so I think as we study Berkshire Hathaway, and it's the recent phase of the past 20 years, so becoming 80% of owners of subsidiary owned companies, we'll learn more and more about Tom Murphy and his approach to business management.
Thanks for watching. Make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you don't miss out on the next podcast episode and new investing resources.
What are your takeaways and thoughts on this discussion? Let us know in the comments section below.